Marking only 4 prime ministers in almost 60 years, Singapore inaugurates Lawrence Wong. With one party maintaining power since independence, the tiny developing nation became one of the world's most prosperous. But while Singapore has one of the least corrupt, most efficient governments, human rights groups criticize limits on political freedom and civil liberties. I'm Andrea Sanke, and today's newsmaker is Singapore. At the age of 51, Lawrence Wong is a relatively young leader for Singapore and is the first not to have attended an elite secondary school. Now, he plays the guitar, loves the blues and jazz, and unlike 2 of the 3 prime ministers before him, he's not a member of Singapore's founding family. But still, there is a theme of continuity. Wong's predecessor, Lee Hsien Loong, will remain in the cabinet, and it's unlikely Wong will significantly change how the ruling People's Action Party governs the island. The PAP has held a firm grip on power ever since Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in the 1960s.
I want continuity because we should build on what we have today. We should affirm and reinforce what works well for Singapore. But I also want change because we should re-examine and refresh our current approaches and be prepared to break new ground in order to adapt more effectively to a rapidly changing environment.
Singapore's rise since its independence has been nothing short of miraculous. From its chaotic early beginnings, the man credited with shaping its politics and drastically reducing corruption is Kuan Yew. Known as the father of Singapore, he co-founded the PAP. His premiership was described as semi-authoritarian by the West, but he argued that his actions were vital for development, and many would say he was right. Margaret Thatcher was one of Lee's greatest admirers, watching on as the island's strict governance produced a meteoric rise in wealth. One of Lee's earliest policies was to clean up corruption in the police force and pay high salaries to politicians to reduce the temptation to take bribes. Singapore is now ranked as the 5th least corrupt country in the world, while its strategic location has made it an ideal hub for international trade and commerce. Singapore has adopted an export-oriented development model over the years, focusing on the production of electronics, chemicals, and petrochemicals. The country has also created a financial system to attract companies from all over the world to invest in Singapore. It has built necessary infrastructure, given tax incentives, and maintained low tariffs. Now, these have made Singapore one of Asia's top financial centers with a thriving banking and wealth management industry. Singapore also owes its wealth to a massive port. It is the world's 2nd biggest and a key transfer hub for trade between Europe and Asia. And yet, for all the positive aspects of the island's development, it does have its detractors. Here's how Human Rights Watch describes Singapore in its country profile.
Singapore's political environment remains overwhelmingly repressive, with serious restrictions on free expression, association, and peaceful assembly through overly broad criminal laws and regulations.
So will Lawrence Wong make any changes to the way Singapore is governed and actually modify the terms of that unspoken contract between the state and its people? Or will his character alone prove to be the only difference?
That someone from a public housing estate is able to rise to become the prime minister, someone who, because by working hard, has been able to reap the success of that hard work. I think that is something that appeals very much, to Singaporeans as part of the whole, Singapore dream. And of course, his hobbies, such as strumming the guitar and the blues, the jazz, and the slow rock, I think in many ways have also cultivated this image, that he is relatable. I mean, the idea of his predecessors, playing a musical instrument, entertaining Singaporeans or singing. I mean, think that, for example, of Kuan Yew, is something which, his predecessor would never have done.
So, does Lawrence Wong mark the beginning of a new era for Singapore, or more of the same? Because as some Singaporeans might say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Singapore, the chairperson of the Singapore Democratic Party, Paul Tambyah. Also in Singapore, Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore, Chong Ja Ian. And from Boston, the Director of Asia Human Rights and Labor Advocates, Phil Robertson. Thanks all so much for being with me. Paul, I'll begin with you and give us a sense of whether this feels like the country is on the verge of something different because, you know, at least as an individual, Lawrence Wong, he's unique compared to his predecessors, and opposition parties like yours have been performing better in recent elections, which should up the pressure on the ruling party to improve its standing, should it not?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Lawrence Wong is quite different from his predecessor, but probably less different from his predecessor than our second prime minister, Goh Chok Tong, was different from Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, frankly, there are very few people on earth who are like Lee Kuan Yew. And so Lawrence Wong, you know, he worked with Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, now ex-Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, very closely. And frankly, to be honest and to be fair, I don't think that the progress of the opposition parties in Singapore has been great. You know, despite winning close to 40% of the vote, we only, we don't have any seats. And the Workers' Party themselves have less than 10% of the seats in Parliament.
And why is that? Is that gerrymandering or what's the cause there?
Well, it's primarily gerrymandering. I mean, we're almost in the same league as the US Congress, where 94% of congressmen get re-elected every congressional election. Almost every seat in Singapore is a safe seat. And that's partly because the Electoral Boundaries Review Commission has no transparency in how they go about dividing the electoral boundaries. We also have this very unique structure called the group representative constituencies, where you get 3 or 4 seats, actually up to 5 seats combined together, ostensibly to ensure minority representation. But even before we had these group representative constituencies, we had a pretty decent representation of all the different ethnic groups in Singapore's parliament. So, you know, people are very suspicious about that, whether it's a means for the ruling party to bring in weaker candidates on the coattails of ministers.
You know, it's interesting, Paul, because you noted that as far as Singapore's political development is concerned since independence, you believe the country really has regressed.
I think so. And it's partly due to the fact that, you know, in the early days, there was a very strong opposition. And this is in the period when we were still part of Malaysia, and even before that, when we had internal self-government. And that opposition, interestingly enough, came from within the PAP. There were members of the so-called left wing of the PAP who split, became the Barisan Socialists, and they became a significant opposition in Parliament. And that actually led to some of the most progressive policies in Singapore that we take for granted today. Public housing, better healthcare, universal public education. And all of those things were put in place when we had a very strong opposition in Parliament to kind of hold the PAP's feet to the fire.
Okay, Paul, though, very quickly, I just want to go back to the initial part of my question. Do you think this marks any kind of change to come, though, with this inauguration?
Well, obviously, I'm an optimist. So I do hope that this marks a positive change. And I think, you know, when Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong took over from Lee Kuan Yew, there was a lot of optimism. And some of the right moves were made, but things unfortunately went south very quickly after that. And we had the Operation Spectrum, which actually crippled civil society in Singapore for more than 20 years. So I'm just hoping history doesn't repeat itself and that Prime Minister Lawrence Wong really does something bold and dramatic. I think, you know, if he were to, if one of the first things that he did were to decide to set aside POFMA, which is one of the most onerous laws that we have. It's supposedly a law against online falsehoods, but so far it's primarily been targeted at alternative voices, including interpretations of statistics.
Very interesting. Okay, let me get Ian's take on this. I mean, do you think Lawrence Wong will actually do something bold? Or do you get more of the sense that he might not have too much choice but to continue with the same policy because politically he will have to work to continue to maintain the power of his party, the PAP?
So, to start off, I'd say that this claim about being more open and more consultative, we've heard it from previous prime ministers when they took office, right? This was something that Goh Chok Tong said when he took office in 1990. This was something that Lee Hsien Loong said when he took office in 2004. But I think you can argue how much they have actually opened up. So that's one thing. The other is, in some respects, it's difficult to sort of see where Lawrence Wong is coming from and where he wants to go, apart from some of the, I guess, rhetorical gestures that he's made. So he says he will listen to Singaporeans, etc. But and he's pro-Singapore. But what that actually means is less clear. He has a career as a civil servant, as a bureaucrat, where he's built up a reputation for being an effective implementer, but there's no real idea about what he values, politically speaking, and where he wants to go, politically speaking. Even in his sort of statements, leading up to the taking over of the office, he stressed continuity. But at the same time, he's also talked about how the world is different now. So you have a different world, but you want to do the same thing. For me, I mean, maybe I'm a simple guy. That I find that a little bit confusing. And then finally, I think when you look at his efforts to be sort of more personable by playing the guitar on social media and playing with furry animals, that's all well and good, but that doesn't sort of show, where he wants to go, what his plan is, why Singaporeans should support that plan. So I think we are all still waiting to find out. And to the last point that you had raised about, how much leeway he has, certainly this first cabinet that he's formed has a lot of senior PAP, People's Action Party stalwarts, including the immediate past Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, serving as senior minister. So the degree to which he has leeway to disagree with them is not entirely known, especially since the Singapore process, political process, is somewhat somewhat opaque.
Yeah. And that brings us now, let me ask Phil Robertson about that angle of this, because there are many who argue, not least human rights advocates, saying that the success of Singapore has come at a cost of political repression, suppression of certain human rights. Some say it's worth it. Others say it's truly unfair. Where do you see Singapore today?
Well, right now, we're not seeing any sort of significant changes in the human rights realm. Obviously, we hope that there will be changes made. We hope that Lawrence Wong will follow through on his rhetoric and listen to the people of Singapore, because if he was listening to the people of Singapore, and particularly the youth, he would recognize that people don't necessarily want to always be told what to do, that the PAP doesn't always have all the answers, and that, in fact, an inclusive and consultative process means listening to public criticism as well. And this has been the major problem, that the PAP and the government don't want to listen to public criticism. When independent media has actually reported on that criticism, they face being shut down. When advocates and civil society people have raised concerning issues, whether it be about the death penalty, about the treatment of migrant workers, about basic civil and political rights like the Public Order Act and things like that, they have been shut down. They have faced persecution. They've faced prison. So, is the PAP, as the ruling party, really prepared to listen? Lawrence Wong, let's be very clear. He's not only taking over as prime minister, but he's got to lead the party in an election that will come sometime by, say, mid-2025. And I think that a lot of people in the party are going to be very nervous about change. There has been always a great deal of concern that the 4G leadership, the fourth generation leadership of the PAP, is not quite up to the task. So there's a lot of consternation inside the ruling party. And when we see that kind of thing happen, in the past we have seen a sort of conservative circle the wagons approach rather than the sort of outgoing, innovative, kind of progressive change that I think would be necessary if Singapore was really going to turn a page on human rights issues.
Okay. Well, let me ask Paul and Ian to speak about that change. Paul, I'll start with you. What do Singaporeans really want to see fundamentally change in Singaporean society? We've heard a lot lately about their being very tired of the rat race, that Singapore is one of the most overworked and stressed out societies because of the work culture there, and they're seeing kind of less and less return for the amount that they put in to this work culture. So describe to us from your perspective what you think Singaporeans want most as far as changes, significant change is concerned. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think I can speak for all Singaporeans, but we do visit the neighborhoods in the constituencies where we've been competing. We talk to people. We interact with young people, with both the activists as well as the residents in the neighborhoods. And I can tell you the one thing that comes through is, as you correctly pointed out, it's this whole issue of the rat race, the cost of living. Singapore has been ranked consistently as one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in. And unfortunately, that's actually put a squeeze on the population. And the government has not really come up with a concrete solution to that. In fact, many people think that the PAP government's approach is contributing to the problem. They've brought in large numbers of low-wage workers, who come in trying to earn a decent living. But the main thing that they do is that they effectively drive down the wages, because there is no minimum wage in Singapore. There are also very few labor protections, which we believe should apply to everyone. Whether you're a Singaporean or you're a migrant worker, you should have the same labor protections, and you should have the access to a similar minimum wage. So those are kind of stresses that contribute to tension, I guess.
Fair enough. And let me ask Ian, because Singapore has in part been very successful because it managed to maintain kind of a stronger social safety net. So, people weren't left behind in globalization, and that helped prevent kind of a more humiliating wealth gap from developing. Do you think, though, that's been maintained, and can it continue to be maintained in a way that will keep the public satisfied with the PAP's performance?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I guess that whole term, social safety net, is it's a bit controversial in Singapore. There's the idea that people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But you are right that there are certain public provisions that essentially are some sort of social safety net. So this includes public house, highly subsidized public housing. This includes highly subsidized university education, free education up to secondary school, and healthcare that is some elements can be quite subsidized. That having been said, Singapore does face, like many other countries that have really embraced globalization, and increased inequality that is of increasing concern. And that's a pressure that many people face. They talk about the high cost of living, and the high housing prices despite the subsidized housing. And that's something that Lawrence Wong has said that he would look at and try to address. We haven't quite seen how. There's the issue of what we call HDB lease decay. The HDB is the Housing Development Board. That's the name of the public housing agency that delivers the public housing. The public housing isn't owned; it's on a long-term lease. So one of the things that happened in the 90s was that the Central Provident Fund is essentially the sort of pension. People were encouraged to use that to pay for their housing, with the expectation that once their children grew up, they could downsize and have a nice nest egg. Right, but the thing is, as the public housing gets older, the price drops, right? Especially for the really older generation of public housing, and so that nest egg for retirement might not be as
big as people had expected, that could
Yeah.
add to pressure. And a lot of these concerns have, I think, contributed to the lower birth rate in Singapore, which is also of concern. So these are things that happen despite the sort of social provisions that are present, right? So that, of course, raises questions about whether what was put in place decades ago is still keeping up with the changing circumstances.
Okay. I'll tell you what, I'm going to change tact slightly at this point because the clock is ticking. And Phil, I know you're a human rights advocate, but you also do know geopolitics very well and how they play into dynamics in politics and what it means for the societies at large. And in Singapore, we're going to see going forward this nation state or city-state becoming kind of at the center of what many are seeing as this push and pull between the interests of the United States and the West versus China. How do you expect that to kind of affect how Singapore is governed going forward? How much are these international global geopolitics really an issue in Singapore?
Well, I think that Singapore, like many of the other governments in Southeast Asia, is working very hard to not get caught on one side or the other. They are trying to straddle the fence between the United States and China. So far, they have been able to do it fairly effectively. I think that China recognizes the importance of Singapore as a leading member of ASEAN, as someone that they can talk to as a majority Chinese country that is independent, but also listens to what China has to say. So I think it's important to recognize that as long as Singapore continues to play a sort of tactical and effective role for both the United States and China, I think it will be able to succeed in its effort to remain in the middle and not be pulled into one side or the other. And that, frankly, is the smartest strategy that Singapore and the other Southeast Asian nations could have. I mean, as we see a sort of growing new Cold War between China and the United States in Asia, you know, many of these countries don't really benefit from being too far on one side or the other. There are obviously exceptions, with Philippines on the U.S. side, Cambodia on the China side. But I think that Singapore is smart to try to remain in the middle, and I think they will be able to do so because, you know, they offer things to the United States, like, for instance, ship visits and other support. They're a major investment hub, a major business hub. And Singapore is also really, at this point, eating Hong Kong's lunch. I mean, there used to be a competition between Singapore and Hong Kong. It's pretty clear with Hong Kong going fully under Beijing's control that the international investment atmosphere in Hong Kong has really been diminished, and many people are now looking to Singapore as the new regional business hub for international business. Interesting that you say that, because I've heard mention of that as well as a potential factor in increasing the wealth gap, because more of the, you know, wealth managers, the bankers, they're going to start moving into Singapore at an even faster rate from Hong Kong. Remains to be seen if that will play well into the wealth dynamics of the country at large. But let me come back to Paul and ask your opinion on the same question I put to Phil. In that, do you think Lawrence Wong is best poised to manage now that increasingly kind of delicate, arguably volatile relationship between the West and China, with Asia, I mean, Singapore straight in the middle of it?
Well, you know, I think one of the things, as Ian pointed out, is Lawrence has filled his cabinet with experienced PAP veterans. So he's not going to have to manage that himself. But I strongly suspect that he will be delegating a lot of that work to some of the seniors. But actually, Ian's one of the experts on China, Taiwan, and the U.S. Relations. So maybe I'll yield my time to Ian for his expert opinion.
Fair enough. Yeah, we only have 2 minutes left. Ian, go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to quickly say that I actually disagree slightly with Phil. The sort of premise that that Singapore can stick to the middle is based on a assumption that the United States and the PRC will continue to accommodate each other and accept states in the middle, having some sort of leeway as competition becomes more. It becomes fiercer between the U.S. and the PRC. You could be standing still, but the U.S. and PRC positions could be shifting. What was acceptable at one point in time might be less acceptable at another. So this sort of trying to have your cake and eat it too becomes more challenging as the policy space between the that both the U.S. and the PRC can accept gets smaller. How Singapore, like other Southeast Asian states, will try to tack through that, it's not clear. ASEAN is not a very effective regional organization on in terms of initiative. So these are challenges that Singapore must face. I note that yes, that you have a lot of third generation PAP leaders on the cabinet. However, none of the fourth generation leaders that Wong represents have had any experience leading a ministry that is in charge of foreign affairs, security, or defense. They are strong on the social side, they are strong on the economic side, but not on the security side.
Okay. Ian, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank really all three of my panelists so much for their time on this edition of the Newsmakers. Great to have you all. And our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, or actually X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sanke. We'll see you next time.